Red tears were said to have streamed down a devout mother's face during a procession, shaking an entire town's faith. But this is a different story, one of quiet strength. An inexplicable series of events transformed one woman's simple life into a journey of profound trials and earthly doubts. Amidst unexpected turns and family reckonings, an ordinary woman became a symbol of hope and sacrifice. This is a story about true faith that transcends the visible. Prepare to be moved, leave a like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching this remarkable story unfold. In the rolling hills of a small town nearly forgotten by time, where the sky seemed to touch the mountains at dusk, lived Eleanor Hayes. At 72, her face carried the map of every story lived, every season weathered, every seed planted. Her hands, calloused like the bark of the ancient trees protecting her small homestead, had never known the meaning of rest. But it was precisely these hands that held the most precious secret of those parts, the ability to draw life, even from the driest earth. That April morning, when dew still adorned the leaves like tiny diamonds, Eleanor awoke with an unusual tightness in her chest. Sitting on the edge of her time-worn wooden bed, she gazed through the window at the first sunbeams hurrying to announce the day. Something was different. The wind whispered messages only her experienced heart could decipher. Trouble's brewing, she thought, recalling an old saying her grandmother repeated when she sensed severe changes coming. Her bare feet touched the packed earth floor, feeling the firmness that had always sustained her in moments of uncertainty. Her humble cabin, built by her late husband's hands 50 years ago, seemed to welcome her in a silent embrace each morning. The simple walls, mute witnesses to joys, tears, and prayers, held secrets that would never be revealed. Every corner of that house told a piece of Eleanor's story, a story of quiet resilience and unwavering faith. As she lit the wood-burning stove to prepare her strong black coffee, the one luxury she allowed herself daily, she thought of the 3 children life had given her and then taken far away. "Mom, the big city needs our strength," they had said one after another, carrying small suitcases filled with dreams too big for this place. The eldest, Jacob, was now a doctor in the state capital. The middle child, Anthony, worked with computer, things she would never understand. And Mary, the youngest who had left last, leaving an even bigger void, was a teacher somewhere on the coast. They all sent money monthly, all called on Sundays, all promised to visit next vacation. But the land seemed to swallow those promises, just as it swallowed the seeds Eleanor planted each season. The coffee aroma drifted up the makeshift chimney, spreading through the nearly deserted neighborhood. Of the 20 cabins that once formed the community of Clearwater Creek, only 7 still kept their doors open. The young left, the old passed away, and the town slowly withered, like an unwatered plant. Samuel, her closest neighbor and only confidant since her husband's death, knocked on the door when the sun was already high in the sky. "Eleanor, did you feel that shaking early this morning?" he asked, his eyes wide like he'd seen a ghost. "No shaking, Samuel. Just the strong wind rattling the branches of the old oak," she replied, pouring a mug of coffee for her friend, even though she knew something deeper stirred in the bowels of that land. "It wasn't wind, woman. The ground shook. Judith down by the creek said she saw the water in her well slosh like someone threw a rock in, and her rooster crowed out of turn, 3 times straight." Eleanor shook her head disapprovingly. She knew Judith's tendency for exaggeration, making mountains out of molehills. But there was something in Samuel's eyes, a genuine fear that made her own heart quicken. "And that's not all," he continued, lowering his voice as if revealing a state secret. "Men from the city arrived last night. They're staying at Arthur's Inn. Say they're here to buy land." The earthenware mug almost slipped from Eleanor's fingers. Land buyers were like vultures. They only showed up when they smelled death. In this case, the slow death of Clearwater Creek. What land do they want to buy? "There's hardly anything left around here worth the trip," she said, trying to sound disinterested, while her heart hammered against her ribs. "Our land, Eleanor. All of it, even your place with the spring." The spring, that small eye of water bubbling up between the rocks at the back of her property, was the true heart of Clearwater Creek. As long as she could remember, Eleanor had cared for that spring as if it were an extension of her own life. Even in the harshest droughts, when other wells in the region dried up, Eleanor's spring continued to pour forth crystal-clear water, as if some divine force protected it. And what do these men want with our water? Wasn't the mining company that dried up the big river 10 years ago enough? She questioned, feeling indignation rise like bile in her throat. They say they're going to build a resort, Eleanor. A place for rich folks to relax and swim in an artificial waterfall. Samuel's words landed like stones in her stomach. A resort. Artificial waters. Outsiders invading the last breath of peace left in that valley. And her spring, her precious gift, turned into a tourist attraction for people who would never understand the sacred flow of those waters. They'll have to carry me out of here feet first, she declared, with the firmness of someone who had weathered worse storms. Samuel nodded, but his eyes revealed doubt. At 78, with one leg shorter than the other, and a cough no tea could cure, what resistance could he offer? And Eleanor, alone in that cabin, with what strength would she fight against the progress that came bulldozing everything in its path? They're offering good money, Eleanor. Enough to buy a house in the city near your children. Maybe it's time to rest a bit, he suggested, avoiding her penetrating gaze. Rest is for the weary, Samuel, and I still have plenty of earth to till, plenty of seeds to plant. When her neighbor left, carrying the weight of uncertainty on his shoulders, Eleanor felt something break inside her. Not fear, not even sadness. It was a kind of quiet fury, the kind that grows slowly like deep roots, infiltrating the empty spaces of the soul. That afternoon, she did something she hadn't done in years. She walked to the small shelf in the corner of the room where she kept a Bible, lit a candle, and prayed. Not the memorized prayers her mother had taught her, but simple, direct words born from the urgency of the moment. Lord, give me strength. Not for myself, I've lived my life, but for this land that still has life to give. The flickering candlelight seemed to answer, dancing shadows on the walls. For an instant, Eleanor felt watched, as if unseen eyes witnessed her moment of vulnerability. A shiver ran down her spine when, outside, thunder cracked across the cloudless sky, a sign the old folks considered an omen of great changes. The next morning, 3 sharp knocks on the door announced the arrival of the unwelcome visitors. Eleanor, who had been up since the first rooster crow, straightened her worn dress and tied a colorful scarf around her head, a small act of dignity in the face of what was coming. There were 3 men, 2 young men in sharp suits with shoes, so shiny they reflected the sun, and an older one whose friendly expression couldn't hide the greed in his small eyes. The latter stepped forward, extending his hand with a smile too wide to be sincere. Mrs. Hayes? I'm Victor Miles, Director of New Horizons Development. These are my associates, Lucas and Frank. We hope we're not disturbing you too early. Eleanor didn't take the offered hand, nor did she offer coffee, an unforgivable breach of country etiquette that clearly signaled her position. I've been up since the crack of dawn, mister. What do you want here? Victor Miles's smile faltered for a second but quickly recovered. Men like him didn't get where they were without knowing how to handle resistance. Well, Mrs. Hayes, we've come with an offer that will change your life. Did you know you're literally sitting on a gold mine? The only treasure I have is what God gave me. This land to plant and clean water to drink, she replied dryly. Unperturbed, Victor continued his rehearsed speech, talking about development, opportunities, property value appreciation, words that sounded foreign to Eleanor's ears. While he spoke, the other 2 circled the property, taking pictures, making notes, pacing distances, like vultures studying their prey. And for that reason, Mrs. Hayes, he finally concluded, we're prepared to offer $300,000 for your property. That's more than double its market value. $300,000. It was enough money to buy 10 cabins like hers, money that could guarantee medicine for the rest of her life, frequent visits to her children, maybe even a flat screen TV like the one she'd seen at Arthur's place. For a brief moment, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine a life without the daily weight of the hoe, without waking before the sun, without the constant struggle against pests and droughts. A life of rest, perhaps in the city, near the grandchildren she barely knew. Then her eyes fell on the old mango tree beside the house, the same one her husband had planted the day Jacob was born. Now enormous, it provided shade, fruit, and shelter for birds that filled the mornings with their songs. How many stories could that tree tell? How much children's laughter had echoed under its branches? And if the trees could talk, what would the ancient oak that guarded the edge of her land say? What excuses would she give the creek that snaked cheerfully through the back of the property? "It's not for sale," she finally answered, with a calmness that contrasted with the storm. Her chest. Victor Miles blinked, confused. He wasn't used to refusals, especially when the money talks so loud. "Mrs. Hayes, perhaps you didn't understand correctly. That's $300,000, cash. You could buy a comfortable house in the city, be close to doctors, your children." "I understood perfectly, mister. And my answer is no, this land has no price because it's not for sale." The developer's eyes hardened. The cordial smile gave way to a calculating expression. "You know it's only a matter of time, don't you? All your neighbors have already agreed to sell. What will you do here alone when everyone leaves, when there's no one left to help if you need it?" It was a veiled threat, but Eleanor knew that kind of persuasion well. She had lived long enough to recognize when they tried to play on her fears. "I've been practically alone for years, mister. And still, the land sustains me and I sustain it. We're good companions." Victor Miles adjusted his tie, visibly irritated. The other two stopped their activities, sensing the situation was getting complicated. "Think carefully, ma'am. We're not talking about sentimentality, but business. $400,000, my final offer. Anything more would be corporate insanity." Eleanor didn't reply. She simply turned her back and went inside, closing the door. Through the window, she watched the three men conferring in her yard, gesturing like agitated chickens. Finally, they got into their gleaming car and drove off, kicking up dust on the dirt road. When silence returned, Eleanor felt the weight of her decision. She wasn't foolish. She knew those men wouldn't give up easily. They had money, power, and influence, weapons against which her hoe and her faith seemed insignificant. In the days that followed, the news spread through what remained of the community. One by one, her few neighbors came to visit, some trying to convince her to sell, others expressing silent support. Samuel was the only one who remained faithfully by her side, despite the doubts gnawing at him. "They offered double for my land," Eleanor said, "because of the spring on your property. The whole project depends on you selling." It was valuable information. If her small piece of land was so crucial, perhaps she had more bargaining power than she initially imagined. On the night of the seventh day after the developer's visit, Eleanor woke with a start. A metallic noise came from the direction of the spring. Grabbing her lantern and a piece of wood she kept beside the bed, she advanced through the darkness of the yard. 2. Figures moved furtively among the trees. In the dim lantern light, she recognized Victor Miles's young associates. One held some kind of equipment that reflected the moonlight. "What are you doing on my property at this hour?" she called out, her voice betraying no fear. The men froze, caught red-handed. The younger one seemed genuinely scared, but the other maintained his composure. "Just taking some measurements, Mrs. Hayes, for the environmental impact study," he replied with false cordiality. "Get out immediately, or I'll call the sheriff for trespassing." The men exchanged quick glances. They knew the threat was almost empty. The nearest sheriff's office was nearly an hour's drive away, and they'd hardly bother coming out for an old woman's complaint. "Illegal measurements won't help your eminent domain case," Eleanor continued, playing a desperate bluff. "My lawyer's son explained all my rights." The mention of a lawyer in the family had an effect. Quickly gathering their equipment, the men backed away, but not before leaving a threat hanging in the air. "You're just delaying the inevitable, ma'am. This project is going to happen, with or without your cooperation." When they disappeared. Into the darkness, Eleanor sank onto a fallen log, trembling not with fear, but with fury. They were willing to act in the shadows, like thieves. What else were they capable of? The next morning, she discovered the answer to that question. The spring, her precious source of crystal-clear water, was clogged with dirt and rocks. Someone had deliberately blocked the natural flow of water. Her trembling hands removed the obstacles, freeing the flow again. But the message was clear. This was just the beginning. It was at this critical point that the unexpected happened. Mary, her youngest daughter, arrived without warning. At 42, she carried the same determination in her eyes as her mother, and in her heart, a love for the land that her city education hadn't completely erased. "Samuel called me, Mom. Told me what's happening," she explained, hugging the old woman tightly. "I came to see how I can help." Something inside Eleanor warmed, an ember long dormant from loneliness now rekindled. Having Mary back, even temporarily, felt like a sign that the fight was worthwhile. Together, mother and daughter began to articulate a more organized resistance. Mary, with her worldly knowledge and connections in the capital, brought new strategies to the battlefield. First, she contacted journalist friends, who published the story of the elderly woman resisting a large development project alone. Then, she alerted environmental groups who quickly became interested in preserving the spring, one of the last uncontaminated natural sources in the region. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued her daily routine, planting, harvesting, praying. But now, each act took on the contours of resistance. Each collard green sprouting from the earth seemed like a small green soldier in her silent army. The presence of strangers became constant in Clearwater Creek. Journalists, activists, curious onlookers, everyone wanted to meet the guardian of the spring, as Eleanor came to be called in the reports. Her simple story had become a symbol of resistance against unchecked greed and predatory development. Victor Miles didn't take long to react. If he couldn't win with money or intimidation, he would try bureaucracy. Questions arose about the land. Deeds, insinuations that Eleanor was merely a squatter with no legal rights. Veiled threats of eminent domain for public utility. It was then that Jacob, the eldest son, entered the fray. As a renowned lawyer in the capital, he brought the weight of the law with him. He discovered that Eleanor's land had a legitimate deed dating back to her grandfather's time. More than that, the spring on her property fed underground streams, supplying water to 3 neighboring municipalities, making it a legally protected watershed area under environmental law. Anthony, the middle son, contributed in his own way. With his tech knowledge, he created a website and social media pages, telling his mother's story and denouncing the questionable practices of New Horizons development. Within days, thousands of people were following the case, amplifying the pressure on the investors. The family, once scattered across the country, now rallied around a common cause, defending not just a piece of land, but an entire way of life, a history, a heritage. The climax of the conflict arrived 3 months after the developers' first visit. A community meeting was called in the hall of the old, now closed rural schoolhouse. On one side, Victor Miles and his team, with colorful charts and promises of progress. On the other, Eleanor and her children, supported by environmental activists, and a few residents still resisting the sale of their land. The developer, now clearly impatient with the obstacles, presented what he called the final proposal, an eco-resort that would preserve the spring as a central attraction, jobs for local residents, and an even larger compensation for Eleanor. $1 million, a sum that made the audience whisper in amazement. When it was her turn to speak, Eleanor rose slowly. Silence filled the hall. She wasn't an experienced speaker, but every word she uttered carried the weight of decades lived in harmony with that land. "Mister, you talk about money as if it's the only language in the world. But this land speaks other languages. The language of the rain falling at the right time, the wind announcing changes, the seeds that only sprout when planted with love." Her voice, usually soft, now echoed with a strength that surprised even her children. "You offer me $1 million. It's a lot of money, yes. But tell me, what's the worth of the robin's song that wakes me every morning? What's the price of the sunset painting my porch red? How much do the memories of my husband planting each tree in that orchard cost? These are things your money can't buy, mister." The audience, previously divided, now listened in respectful silence. Even Victor, Miles's allies, seemed touched by the sincerity of this simple woman. This spring isn't mine to sell. It was here long before me, and it will be here long after I'm gone. I'm just its keeper for a short time. What gives you the right to turn it into a tourist attraction, just because you have the money? Victor Miles tried to interrupt, but Jacob, with a lawyer's authority, ensured his mother finished. My proposal is different, Eleanor continued. Leave the spring and the land around it in peace. Build your hotel further down if you want. But this piece of heaven God entrusted to me, this will be preserved not for me nor for my children, but for all who come after us. A profound silence followed her words. Then, slowly, applause began. Timid at first, then stronger, until it became an ovation that shook the old schoolhouse walls. Victor Miles, realizing public opinion had turned completely against him, tried one last play. And who guarantees that you, after we leave, won't sell to someone else? Or that your children, after you, pass on, won't do the same? It was Mary who answered, stepping forward. We've already thought about that. We're proposing the creation of a private nature preserve, legally established. The spring and the surrounding land will be protected by law, regardless of who owns it. The proposal took even Eleanor by surprise. Her children had planned it, without telling her, fearing her initial resistance to giving up total control over her land. But now, understanding the scope of the solution, she nodded with a smile. The following months were a period of intense activity in Clearwater Creek. Eleanor's story had gained national attention, attracting the interest of authorities and environmentalists. The resort project was redesigned, moved away from the spring area, and incorporated genuinely sustainable principles, not just as a marketing strategy, but as a condition imposed by the mobilized community. The Eleanor Hayes Nature Preserve was officially created, protecting not only the spring, but all the surrounding biodiversity. A small environmental education center was built at the entrance to the property, where visitors could learn about the importance of preserving water sources. Ironically, the preserve became one of the main attractions of the region, visited even more than the luxury resort that was finally built 2 kilometers away. Eleanor, reluctant at first, eventually took on the role of occasional guide, sharing her ancestral knowledge of medicinal plants, nature cycles, and sustainable agriculture with visitors of all ages. Her cabin received some improvements: an indoor bathroom, solar power, running water, but remained essentially the same as she insisted. You don't renovate an old house all at once or it loses its soul, she'd tell her children when they urged her to build a new house for her. The most surprising development was the gradual rebirth of Clearwater Creek. With attention focused on the region, other small sustainable businesses began to emerge. Former residents who had left for the big cities returned, bringing new knowledge but thirsty for the roots they had left behind. Young farmers, inspired by Eleanor's story of resistance, arrived seeking land for organic farming. One spring afternoon, 2 years after the start of that seemingly lost battle, Eleanor sat under the old mango tree, watching a group of children, carefully exploring the creek banks guided by Mary, who now divided her time between teaching in the city and an environmental education project at the preserve. Samuel, her faithful friend, joined her, bringing 2 cups of freshly brewed coffee. Who would have thought, Eleanor, that your stubbornness would not only save your land but bring new life to the whole town? She smiled, accepting the coffee gratefully. It wasn't stubbornness, Samuel, it was faith. Faith that the land always finds a way to regenerate, as long as we don't give up on it. Watching the sun begin to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Eleanor felt a deep peace. Her struggle had not been in vain. The seeds of resistance she had planted had sprouted into something much larger than she had ever imagined. You know, Samuel, I spent my whole life thinking my mission was to cultivate this land. Only now do I understand that actually, the land was cultivating me. The old friend nodded in silent understanding. No more words were needed between them. The gentle breeze rustled the mango leaves, creating a music that seemed to cradle the dreams of a future that had finally arrived. The weeks that followed, Something extraordinary began to happen at Eleanor's spring. The water, always crystal clear, started showing a faint bluish tint at certain times of the day, especially at dawn. Some said it was just the light reflecting off natural minerals. Others, more connected to old beliefs, whispered about divine blessings and miraculous waters. The news spread quickly. Soon people from neighboring towns began visiting the spring, bringing bottles to take home some of that special water. Stories of unexplained healings started circulating. Josephine's rheumatism improving after daily bathing, little Michael's asthma mysteriously disappearing, old Tony's back pain easing after decades of suffering. Eleanor observed it all with a mixture of skepticism and reverence. She didn't believe in instant miracles, but she knew well the healing power of nature when respected in its cycles. Perhaps the real cure lay in the act of faith of those people, in the reconnection with the land, in the contemplative silence beside the spring, far from the noise and hurry of the cities. Eleanor's children reacted differently to the phenomenon. Jacob, ever rational, worried about potential commercial exploitation. Anthony saw the potential for scientific studies on the mineral composition of that special water. Mary, the most sensitive to traditional knowledge, saw an opportunity to revive ancestral wisdom about healing and well-being. In an attempt to organize the spontaneous pilgrimage, the family decided to establish some simple rules. Visitors could take water only for personal use, never for sale. Access to the spring would be limited to certain hours to allow the site's natural regeneration, and a small voluntary contribution would be suggested for the preserve's upkeep. It was in this context that Victor Miles reappeared, almost 6 months after the agreement that had reshaped his original project. This time, he came alone, without his previous arrogant demeanor. He asked to speak with Eleanor privately, a request she granted cautiously. Sitting on the simple porch, watching the flow of visitors arriving at the preserve, he finally revealed the reason for his visit. "Mrs. Hayes, I came to ask for forgiveness." The request, unexpected and seemingly sincere, caught her off guard. Her experienced eyes searched his for any sign of falsehood, but found only genuine weariness. "Forgiveness for what exactly?" she asked without hostility, but with her characteristic frankness. "For not seeing what you saw, for thinking progress could only come by destroying what already existed, instead of building in harmony with it." Victor explained that the resort, built according to the new sustainable principles, was thriving far beyond his expectations. Tourists came specifically attracted by the proximity to the nature preserve and the story of resistance it represented. "You turned my defeat into the greatest business lesson I've ever received," he confessed with a tired smile. "I learned that preserving can be more profitable than destroying." Eleanor remained silent for a few moments, processing his words. She hadn't expected such a complete turnaround from the man who had represented everything she fought against. Still, something in her intuition told her there was truth in this transformation. "You seem different," she finally observed. "Less greedy." Victor laughed humorlessly. "Greed takes its toll, Mrs. Hayes. In my case, it was a heart attack 2 months ago. The doctors said it was stress. I know it was from chasing money without ever having time to spend it on things that matter." The revelation brought a new dimension to their encounter. They were no longer just reconciled adversaries, but two human beings sharing the fragility of existence. "Water from the spring doesn't cure a greedy heart," Eleanor said, with a touch of humor in her wisdom. "But changing your life, that can make a heartbeat better." They talked for a while longer, sharing perspectives on the transformation Clearwater Creek was experiencing. Before leaving, Victor made a surprising proposal. He wanted to finance the expansion of the preserve's environmental education center, turning it into a research institute focused on water sources and sustainability. "It will be a way to give back what I tried to take from here," he explained, "and maybe help other communities preserve their own springs." Eleanor didn't give an immediate answer. She needed to consult her children and the community, which now actively participated in decisions about the preserve. But the seed of that idea found fertile ground in her heart. 2 years have passed since then. The Clearwater Environmental Research Institute became a reality, attracting scientists, students, and activists from all over the country. The small town, which had seemed condemned to oblivion, revived with renewed energy. Abandoned houses gained new residents. Young farmers established organic crops. Local artisans found a market for their products among visitors. Eleanor, now 77, continued living in her improved cabin, steadfastly refusing to trade her wood-burning stove for a push-button stove, as she called electric ones. Her children, once distant, now actively participated in community life. Mary had moved permanently to Clearwater Creek, coordinating the Institute's educational programs. Anthony divided his time between the capital and the town, bringing sustainable technologies and digital literacy to the community. Jacob, while maintaining his career in the city, was a constant presence on weekends, helping establish the legal framework for community projects. One Sunday afternoon, with the family gathered for their weekly lunch, Eleanor watched her grandchildren, 2 from Jacob and 1 from Mary, playing around the spring. The youngest, just 4 years old, talked to the water as if it could answer, creating fantastic stories about water fairies and underground kingdoms. "Grandma," the water told. "Me a secret," the little girl announced, eyes shining when she returned to the adults. "And what secret was that, my flower?" Eleanor asked, playing along. "It said you're a magic tree disguised as a person, that your roots go so deep into the earth they touch the heart of the world." The adults chuckled at the childhood imagination, but Eleanor felt something stir within her. In a way, that fantasy contained a profound truth about her connection to this land. That night, alone in her room, Eleanor mentally revisited the entire journey of the past few years. How her solitary resistance had transformed into a movement. How her small act of courage had inspired so many changes. It wasn't vanity she felt, but a kind of reverent gratitude for the role she had been given in this larger story. She knew she wouldn't live to see all the fruits of that transformation. Like the seed that sacrifices itself for the tree to grow, her time was limited. But she observed with serene satisfaction the buds already sprouting, in the curious eyes of children learning to love the land, in the renewed energy of the community rediscovering its roots, in the care with which every drop of water was now treated. "We sow seeds without knowing exactly what we'll harvest," she murmured to herself as sleep slowly came. But sowing itself is an act of faith in the future. Outside, the spring continued its eternal flow, indifferent to human dramas, yet somehow intertwined with the destiny of that community. And deep within the earth, where ancestral roots met underground waters, something vibrated in perfect harmony, the same harmony Eleanor had always felt, even in the most difficult moments, even when she had stood completely alone in her resistance. Truth she now fully understood and silently conveyed to all who crossed her path was simple and profound. No one is truly alone when they place themselves in service to life, and there is no force more powerful than that of a seed determined to bloom, no matter how barren the soil may seem.